This podcast is brought to you by the ATMS, the Australian Traditional Medicine Society. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining us on the line today is Nora Gedgaudas, who's a board-certified nutritional consultant and a board-certified clinical neurofeedback specialist with over 20 years of successful clinical experience. A recognised authority on ketogenic, ancestrally based nutrition, she's a popular speaker and educator and the author of the best-selling books Primal Body, Primal Mind, as well as Rethinking Fatigue. Nora, I'd like to warmly welcome you to FX Medicine. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great, and thank you so much for having me.
Well,
I'm always happy to do anything with Aussies.
Now, I've got to say, I snipped off so much of your bio because you have done so much, not the least of which is something that's close to my heart, your affinity with wolves. But could you take our listeners through a little bit of your professional background and your awakening to paleo principles from being a stock standard nutritionist?
Right. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I actually spent some time working with wolves and doing some work in wildlife science. And I had a rare opportunity, really kind of a once in a lifetime thing, to travel to an area that's just 500 miles south of the North Pole and spend an entire summer living with a family of wild wolves in the company of the world's foremost wolf biologist, a man by the name of Dr. L. David Meach, who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the North Central Forest Experiment Station, which is out of Minnesota, and which is where I used to live. But at any rate, and when I traveled up there, we were going to be in an area that was exceedingly remote. The closest human village was 350 miles to the south of us. And, there was a military weather station some distance away where we could store some things, but there was not going to be any grocery shopping. There was not going to be any foraging for plant foods or whatever out on the tundra.
Right.
It was all permafrost. Really whatever we could hunt or whatever we could haul in with us was what we had. And so, when you travel to remote places in nature and under, challenging conditions, you want nutrient density and lots of calories and whatever. So we had a lot of that rich foods with us. And, I knew all this was coming, but at the time I was, even though I was quite passionate about nutrition even back then, this was back in 1991, I was at the time bought into the kind of basic concepts in that were popularized or officially recognized in nutrition, that everything, was a low-fat paradigm, that, your diet was supposed to be carbohydrate-based. At the time, I had been, just eating lots of big salads and doing lots of juicing, and I was eating some meat, but I was trying to eat lean meat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to be a good girl for the most part, and I was still eating, some grains and legumes and things like that I don't consume anymore, but or whatever. But I was quite concerned about what was going to befall my health when I went up there and couldn't get my fresh vegetables, right?
Yep.
I thought, well, how am I going to make it through a summer without that? And when I got there, well, actually, on the way there, we stopped in a remote Inuit village on an island that was south of Ellesmere Island, where I actually spent my summer. And it was a little community called Resolute Bay, and about 200 Inuit, I think, living there at the time. And the people there were living so remotely that, maybe once every other week or so, a small Twin Otter plane would fly in with, some different, with the mail and some different provisions and maybe, a few limp vegetables and some non-perishables. And then they had a, grocery store that you could probably touch, stand in the middle of the store and touch all the walls, small space. And, they carried some processed crap and, things, cereals and whatever else.
Yeah.
But the problem with all that is that, it was expensive. And, the community, it's not that the community didn't like those foods. I think that they liked the taste of those foods. And in fact, now that they've become more accessible, it's become a very real problem for them. But back then, it was like too expensive. The most practical way to live was through subsistence. And so at least 80% subsistence anyway. And so people would, they would hunt, seals and walrus, in Wales and musk oxen and polar bears and, whatever have you. They would do their certain amount of catching fish and whatever have you. And that's how they lived. And the front yards were basically the freezers. You'd see dead seals in people's front yards and things like that.
Really?
Natural refrigeration. Yeah.
Wow.
And even in Arctic summer up there, it was still, freezing temperatures. And I noticed, just sort of curiously, because I'm thinking, okay, these folks, they don't get salads up here. There's just no way. And they really don't have access to the supposedly healthy grains and legumes everybody else is supposed to be eating. And nobody here, everybody here looks pretty healthy. I mean, people were not obese. They weren't allowing alcohol up there either, which was a good thing for them, I think.
Yep.
It was a dry community or whatever. So they basically were eating meat and fat for the most part, and not a whole lot else. And I didn't see people who were obese. I didn't, everybody seemed really happy and well adjusted, and it just seemed like a peaceful, happy community. I just, didn't see any problems. And the kids who were out playing on the monkey bars at, 1:00 in the morning in the 24-hour daylight with their Teenage Mutant Ninja T-shirts on and things like that in the freezing temps, they were just happy and curious and well adjusted and all kind of giggling and asking lots of questions, and just terrific kids, and with rosy cheeks and everything. And it was all kind of niggling at me because I'm thinking, how can this be? I mean, how can you have a people group that's living up here eating nothing but meat and fat, which are supposed to be the worst things we can eat, and that's what they live on, and they look great and they seem fine. So, and then I got to Ellesmere, and I had another disconnect because, where I expected to be craving, salads and juices and things like that, suddenly I found myself craving fat for the first time in my life. And I spent the entire summer sitting on my backside on the tundra, not moving very much, because the wolves would get upset if we moved around too much. They were quite comfortable with us and, came to within even a foot or two of us sometimes. But if we had to sit fairly still, and then they were comfortable. If we stood up and walked around, it was a little bit discombobulating for them. They'd get a little agitated by that. So fat, so no working out, no going for jogs, I occasionally took a stroll after hours, we would wrap things up and I would just sometimes go for a little walk on the tundra, but you couldn't walk very far or very fast because the ground was so hummocky, it was so uneven from all the frost heaving and stuff. And so, needless to say, I didn't move very much, sat on my butt, was heavily bundled against the cold. And at the warmest, it actually got into, well, I can only speak in Fahrenheit terms, excuse me, but I'm not from a metric country. But it was, I think 65 degrees at one point was the warmest day that we had. But mostly it would hover, around freezing or whatever. But I was very well bundled and comfortable.
Yeah.
And I was eating cheese and salami and, just all these fat-rich foods, nut butters, nuts, whatever have you. And then once a week I would go to the weather station, and the officer in charge told me I could get anything I wanted out of the mess hall. And all I wanted in the mess hall was this huge bowl of butter, which I was heaping upon, small pieces of toast and eating one after the other until I was too embarrassed to continue every chance I got. And I thought, I couldn't understand why I wasn't gaining weight. And not only did I not gain weight, but by the time I went home at the end of the summer, I'd lost close to 25 pounds.
Right.
And again, I understand there's such a thing as a thermogenic effect, and I don't doubt that was at play, but that wasn't the whole story. And again, based on everything I'd learned up to that point about nutrition, that should not have happened.
Yeah.
And so it niggled at the back of my mind, and until I got back to the States again. And then I happened to stumble across the work of Weston A. Price. And I don't know how familiar your listeners are to his work, but he was a nutritional pioneer that spent time studying, native, indigenous, and also Aboriginal cultures from worldwide over a period of about 10 years. And he covered about 100,000 miles studying in the 1920s, late 20s and early 30s, and discovered that wherever people had consumed a diet that was, native to their, to their culture,
yep.
To their primitive or traditional culture, that people were remarkably healthy and free of disease and, dental problems and, skeletal abnormalities, birth defects. I mean, all the things, or metabolic diseases, God knows, the things that plague us today at an extraordinary,
exactly.
Ever extraordinary rates. And what he discovered after, again, a full decade of doing this in countless cultures that he looked at, that among the healthiest people that he studied, he discovered that there were two things. Now, mind you, we're talking people everywhere from the outback in Australia where you are to the jungles in South America, to Africa, to the remote Celtic isles and things like that, northern Canadian tribes, etc. Obviously, we're talking about vastly different sources of food in some respects,
yes.
right? Lots of different varieties of things. And the thing that I think too many people take away from Weston Price's work is to their conclusion, it's just eat real food and you'll be fine. But Weston Price was smart enough to ask a very important question. Among all of these primitive and indigenous and traditional groups that appear to be optimally healthy, that have nothing wrong with them, what do all of these different diets have in common? And there were two things he found that they all had in common, regardless of where they were in the world. Number one, they all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them. In other words, there weren't any vegetarian or vegan cultures. He looked for them. He was extremely disappointed to not find one. Right. He was sure they had to be one out there, but he couldn't find one. So they all, and the greater the variety of animal foods and things like that, the better off they seemed to be. But they all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them. And then the second quality that was present in every one of these optimally healthy people groups was that the most important food in every case, the most sought after, the most venerated in every case, was those foods that were richest in both fat and fat-soluble nutrients, to the letter. So to me, what you have is a way of distilling down a kind of solid foundational framework that is true across the board. And then what you have with all of these other differences is nuance. And some of those nuances may have, added beneficially to their health, and others may have been, on some level or other potentially compromising, except that as long as the foundations were in place, and their genome was robust enough, which ours isn't anymore, they were able to compensate to whatever degree they needed to for the things they consumed that may have been less optimal for them. Right. I mean, it's not rational to assume that just because our ancestors did something, we should be doing exactly the same thing, because they weren't necessarily trying to extend their lifespan. They were, they weren't
surviving,
necessarily thinking in terms of, of health. They were looking to survive. There were certain foods perhaps that they preferred, and and were able to seek out more consistently, but they would have consumed whatever they had available to them. But it's irrational to assume that everything that they put in their mouths that didn't kill them was of necessity optimal for their health, much less ours.
Mm.
And so what I do in my work is to me, the only rational starting place is the idea that the selective pressures that would have been present as an evolving species and the kinds of foods we would have most consistently had access to as an evolving species would have served to forge our basic physiological makeup and our most basic nutritional requirements. To me, that is the only rational starting place. But then beyond that, what I do is I apply those basic principles to human longevity research to kind of cross-pollinate these concepts and arrive at a more optimized version of what they did.
Yeah.
And, and we know that two things that are going to shorten anyone's lifespan are the excessive demand for insulin, and that's consistent across the board in longevity research. And we also, the excessive consumption of protein is also one of those things that can activate metabolic pathways that serve to unnecessarily shorten our lives. The difference between the two things is that we do have a fundamental requirement for protein, and I believe that protein is best gotten from animal source foods. But there is no scientifically established human dietary requirement for any form of carbohydrate food whatsoever, and we can manufacture all the glucose we need from a combination of protein and fat in the diet.
Right. Okay.
So you can have an essential fatty acid deficiency, you can have an amino acid deficiency, but there's no such thing
as a carb deficiency
in our species. It's a carbohydrate deficiency. There is no such thing.
Okay, but when we talk about these geographically diverse cultures, Australian Aboriginals is a classic because they were landlocked. They were snipped off from the rest of the massive continents.
The Yolngu in northeastern Australia, they get an appreciable amount of seafood. I mean, there were Aboriginal people groups that had access to ocean-based thing. But your point is taken. Yes, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but even Australian Aborigines started to make these breads or bread type foods, but out of like toxic nuts like cycads, macrozapia or something, but they did it by not washing it in a stream, not 1, not 2, but 3 days, and then pulverizing it, drying. It was just it's a really convoluted way of making a bread.
Right.
But they all sought these energy rich foods to survive them. What I think is interesting though is on a hunt, and you mentioned the words hunt, haul, and of course alcohol, only one word of which fits into the jobs of accountancy, police officer and nurse in our Western society, and that's alcohol, Hunt and haul. So is the real problem of our society that we just don't move enough? Like, I know that you said that you didn't move a lot, but you had to get to the wolves.
No, I lived right next to the den. So
oh, really?
I didn't really have to. And when we traveled, we would follow the wolves on their hunts, but we traveled on four-wheelers. Look, our prehistoric ancestors didn't have running shoes or gym memberships. They moved. They had to hunt and gather, right? They had to move around and do things.
Yeah.
But, you didn't have elite sports like, we have where people are just pounding themselves into the ground one day to the next. I mean, I think your average Ironman triathlete would just completely befuddle one of our prehistoric ancestors. So they would have thought these guys were nuts. And yet those prehistoric ancestors probably could have outmatched them, physically in any one event.
Yeah.
And, the thing is that I'd say at least 70% of the equation is diet. I'm not saying that movement and exercise isn't important, but it is not the foundational. It is not necessarily the foundational thing that we need to be focused on when it comes to health. I mean, I'm all for getting out and moving and walking and engaging in activity and whatever else.
Yeah.
It's really important for a lot of reasons. But being sedentary doesn't help.
No.
But it's not the source. That's not the core of the problem.
Right.
A very high percentage of the fat we consume goes to replenishing and rebuilding structure, like our brains, our nervous system. It goes to fueling our immune function, and also making up virtually every cell membrane in our bodies. And whatever is left over from that, if we consume fat in significant excess of what we need, a certain amount of it may get squirreled away. But it's not, if you have high triglycerides, I promise you the problem is not dietary fat. The problem is dietary carbohydrate.
Right.
That the majority of unwanted body fat that people have are the byproduct of excess carbohydrate consumption and not excess fat. However, I will say that the combination of fat is very, very bad. It's like taking a lit fuse and putting it on a powder keg. You kind of have to choose. And if you're going to choose between the two, we have a requirement for fats and fat-soluble nutrients from a variety of sources. We have no foundational requirement whatsoever, as established by science, for carbohydrates of any kind. Not in any textbook of physiology, any medical textbook anywhere.
Yeah. Jeff Leach has commented against the paleo principles, saying that the Hadza tribe ate as much as 30% of calories from honey, but in season. Of course, unlike us, though, they walked to work. What's going on here?
Yes, there was a study published actually looking at the Hadza. It was, in fact, the Hadza.
Yeah. And
also looking at modern humans. And gosh, I would have to dig to find that study, but I will tell you right now that where it was once believed that our energy expenditure is what differentiated our health and well-being, our whatever, between primitive cultures and modern day. It turns out, studying both the Hadza and modern Western culture, that in fact the energy expenditures from both groups were roughly the same, and were not distinguishable. Were not the distinguishing factor between. They just said, we have to look to diet to account for these differences,
right,
in the health and well-being of our.
Nora, the foods you ate and lost weight on, when you mentioned them, there seemed to be a couple of little, let's call them excursions away from ancestral diet, the paleo diet. You said there was a few carbs that you ate.
Sure.
How much of a diversion away from a strict paleo, diet can you make with, let's say, retaining some Western diet without compromising your weight loss and your ancestral sort of diet biochemistry, if you like?
Right. Well, so much of it depends on how you define paleo.
Okay.
In my, and there are almost as many versions of so-called paleo out there as there are individuals claiming to practice it. You're using a term that has become, kind of entered into the cultural parlance, if you will, but and there's certainly a bit of commercialism that's sprung up around it.
Yeah, sure.
I selected the term primal only because, and really the terms are probably exchangeable in most respects. There isn't a technical definition of primal that's different, but I chose the word primal to describe things because because it implied something older, something more basic, something more, more foundational. And in my mind, to me, the term goes just a little bit more, because paleos come to mean so many different things. There's there's a sort of ice age Paleolithic, if you will, and then there's the Neolithic.
Yeah.
They're Neolithic cultures. And the fact is that our world changed enormously of just a little over 10,000 years ago, and completely resculpted the landscape and every living thing on it. And, where for 2.6 million years of our evolutionary trajectory, we shared the planet with close to 120 species, extra species of megafauna, these enormous herbivores that vanished almost in the wink of an eye, about 13,000 years ago, in a fairly cataclysmic series of changes to our climate. We think that the most current theory at hand that seems to have the most to back it up is that there were pieces of a comet that struck the planet, and our back and forth violently over a period of a few years, and these massive ice sheets ended up melting practically overnight, and at the end of it all, and we were left with a bottleneck of life on Earth. It was an extinction event that rivaled that of the dinosaurs, and so all of a sudden now, we're living in a different world. The animals that we're hunting are leaner and more fleet of foot, and as opposed to these enormous, woolly mammoths and mastodons and giant sloths and Irish elk and aurochs and whatever have you, and so we had to come up with other things. And most people's versions of paleo seem to extrapolate from more Neolithic, indigenous, tribal kinds of dietary concepts that are endemic to our more climatically temperate world, and that isn't necessarily the world that we evolved in. I kind of didn't really answer your question concerning the how far can we stray, and again, a lot depends on how it is you want to define paleo. What I use, the term that I use to actually define what I do and how I view things I just recently trademarked this term, and it's primalgenic. In other words, we're talking about a very low carbohydrate approach to diet that is moderate in its protein level. This is not a high meat diet, but that protein, I believe, should be coming mostly from animal source foods, but animal source foods of absolutely uncompromising quality that are totally grass-fed, organic, all that. And then a very wide variety of fibrous vegetables and greens from, a variety of sources, cooked, raw, cultured, however you prefer them, again, of uncompromising quality. And I really don't embrace the use of dairy products, and a lot of people eating paleo do, and for a variety of reasons we could go into, but I would be digressing. And then ultimately, fat is used as the primary source of calories. Now, it makes it sound like, this is basically a fat-based ketogenic approach, but the fats come from an enormous variety of both animal and plant source foods of uncompromising quality, being careful to make sure that there are sufficient essential fatty acids and animal-based fat-soluble nutrients. And there are quite a number of them that cannot be gotten from plant source foods that we have to have if we want to be optimally healthy.
Yeah. And
so, as long as you're operating in alignment with those principles, I think you're fine. And as long as, you're as optimally healthy as you can be, you may have, is the degree to which you have wiggle room, right? With respect to what it takes to remain optimally healthy. The problem is that we live in a world that is so burdened with toxicity, with compromise to our air, water, and food supply, with EMF, pollution, with radiation contamination now. Our oceans have become cesspools of all kinds of things that, are barely pronounceable. And because of that, and one of the things I'm fond of saying is that in the face of so many things that we seemingly have no control over, it's just important to take control of what we can. and to compromise as little as possible. And I think that we're living in actually a much more hostile environment than anything our ancestors could have fathomed. Most of what threatened them was quite tangible. You had your saber-toothed tigers, your
yes.
cantankerous woolly mammoths, your big storms, your volcanic eruptions, whatever have you.
Yep.
Climate changes or seasonal changes, whatever. And for us, we get to live in climate-controlled environments and watch Dancing with the Stars or whatever is on TV, and feel a certain sort of complacency about it all. But the fact of the matter is that we have a range of most of what endangers us is not visible to us. It's floating in the air we breathe. It's
that's a really good point.
It's in the water that we drink. It's in it's genetic modification of the food supply and pesticides and herbicides and 100,000 industrial chemicals around the world and water treatment facilities that not only, even the most modern of them don't test for more than about 200 potential contaminants, but then we're adding contamination by dumping, fluorosalicylate into the water, calling it fluoride, and with guys with hazmat suits, dumping bags with skulls and crossbones on them and warnings to not come into physical contact with the contents are going into our water supply, supposedly for our greater good. And, we can go on and on about all of the things that are compromising us, but we're largely oblivious to it because we're not wired for paying attention to things that we can't see.
The WHO put out a directive with regards to, animal fat and certainly preserved animal meats as being probably carcinogenic, but they always and only mention animal fats. They never, as far as I'm aware, mention animal protein.
No, actually, the World Health Organization announced, their announcement back in 2014 was that it was red meat was this probable carcinogen to humans. And of course, because it was a source of saturated fat, evil saturated fat. Look, for 2.6 million years of our evolutionary history, we've consumed appreciable amounts of these fats. And the first cases of, say, coronary thrombosis actually published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I believe it was 1911 or 1912. And it was seen, cardiovascular disease was seen as a strange, rare anomaly. It's like, whoa, where is this coming from? And Dr. Paul Dudley White, who was personal physician to President Eisenhower at the time, was fascinated with this emerging area of pathology in human health. And he decided, he endeavored to undertake the study of this emerging problem of cardiovascular disease. And his colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. They're like, look, you're so brilliant. Why would you waste your talent on something so unprofitable? And of course, by the 1950s, it was a leading cause of death. Cancer rates, cancer among indigenous societies and even among, older indigenous peoples is virtually non-existent. It has been a very, very, very rare instance. And yet all of a sudden, cancer rates are exploding all over the place, cardiovascular disease exploding all over the place, autoimmune disease exploding all over the place, and on and on and on. And did we suddenly start eating saturated fat and animal source foods? The fact is that in the last few generations now that these official dietary guidelines and all of the fear-mongering around dietary fat, for the first time ever in our history as a species, that we actually have reduced our intake of animal source foods and animal source fats, and what has gone up instead is the preponderance of dietary carbohydrates, both refined and unrefined, and also vegetable oils, frankly, and all sorts of processed vegetable fats that are artificially saturated.
Yeah.
And this, of course, includes things like trans fats, but also interesterified fats, which are rapidly replacing trans fats in the marketplace, and they are just as bad, folks, just as bad. And so we know that malignant cancer cells have many more receptors for insulin than healthy cells do. That the one thing that cancer needs in order to flourish is glucose. That's the primary fuel for cancer. Cancer can't use ketones at all. Now, excess protein can be an impetus for cellular proliferation. And if you're pregnant or trying to become pregnant, or you're a baby, child, or teen, you need the extra protein. You need to be able to make new cells. But if you're anybody else, consuming protein in excess of what you need to meet your basic requirements provides an impetus for activating a certain metabolic pathway we call mTOR, mammalian targeted rapamycin. That's a protein sensor.
Yep.
And when that pathway gets activated, it results in cellular proliferation. And that, it's basically a reproductive mechanism is what it is. It's your body looking around, are there enough nutrients to make new life? If there are, then your body gets to work making new cells. But if there aren't, something kind of magical happens. If you restrict your protein intake to just what you need, but not in excess of that, then what gets switched on instead, if you're also suppressing your requirement for insulin at the same time, by obviously minimizing carbohydrate intake, that what gets upregulated instead is maintenance and repair. And in fact, this is a loophole in Mother Nature's design that was designed to attempt to optimize our functioning in the face of what could be an apparent famine so that we can live long enough and be healthy enough in order to maybe reproduce another day.
Yeah.
And so this is a loophole we can all take advantage of. And that's part of my approach to things, is to moderate that protein intake to just what we need and not more. And because we don't need the carbs, leave them out, with the exception of fibrous vegetables and greens. And then use fat. Fat is a free fuel in this equation. Fat does not actually activate any of these aging pathways at all. So fat can be consumed with relative impunity if it's of sufficient quality, right? And the human brain is unique in all of the animal kingdom, including other primates, in that it's the only brain on the planet that we know of that is capable of running full time on almost nothing but ketones. Now, there are other animals that can create a state of ketosis for brief periods of time under certain circumstances.
Right.
But we are the only species capable of making use of ketones as a full-time fuel, especially our brains.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're born in a state of ketosis. The moment that we pop out of the womb and start suckling, ketones become the major fuel for brain development. And we don't start craving carbohydrates until adults start feeding them to us.
Hunger and being time poor, the archetypical pressures of modern life and the power of convenience.
Right.
How do we overcome these? If we're already in the mill, how do you get people to break out and eat a more ancestral diet while they've got these cravings that have been driving them for so long? Right.
Well, fill your metabolic wood stove with logs and not kindling, for starters. In other words, the type of dietary approach I talk about in my books is the one in which you will be the least hungry. Think about how, maybe whoever's listening to this might want to think about how they might feel if they went for 6 or 7 hours without eating anything, right?
Yep.
Would you be, after 6 or 7 hours of that, how would your energy be? Would you be dragging a little bit? Would you be feeling a little bit irritable? Would you be craving something? Would your mood be a little wonky? Brain fog? Might you be something that rhymes with itchy? Or, once you've eaten a meal after not having eaten for a long time, how do you feel then? Do you feel more energized? You feel like, okay, now I can take on the world. Or do you feel more like taking a nap?
Yeah.
Well, if you said yes to anything that I have just said, you have a problem.
Yeah.
Because none of those things are what are physiologically normal. How are you supposed to feel if you haven't eaten all day? There's only one normal, healthy answer to that question, and that's hungry. And how are you supposed to feel after you've eaten? Again, the only normal, healthy answer to that question is not hungry. And if it's anything else, it's a problem.
Right.
And so by establishing a fat-based metabolism, you won't be hungry. If you want convenience, you can try to make larger meals, once a week, sit down, make some stews, make some soups, make some things that you can prepare in bulk, big roasts, whatever, and then portion up into small containers and freeze and heat up or whatever and live on for the rest of the week. That's relatively convenient.
You'll be doing a webinar for Australian health practitioners for the ATMS on June the 5th, titled Rethinking Nutrition and Brain Health. Can you tell us just a little bit more, without giving too much away, about what you'll be discussing, what practitioners can take home? And I'm going to work in a second question into this. And will you be discussing how to break your intermittent fasting, how to break fast?
I'll basically be, helping people think in terms that, we talk about a mind-body connection, and I think of that as a myth, that the brain and the body are part of the same either functioning or dysfunctioning system. And they have to be understood together in context. You can't, last I looked, most people's heads are screwed onto their bodies. And so what impacts our physical health is invariably going to have an impact on our brain health, right? Our mental, emotional, and our cognitive functioning. And so we have to understand that, our body is our subconscious mind, that these things are not inherently separate. And a lot of people have real problems seeing those things as part of the same thing.
Yeah.
I know people that think that as long as they're not catching a flu bug and they can get up and they're above ground every day and going to work and they, whatever, seem to do okay, that they're physically, that they're healthy, even if they're depressed or anxious or they can't focus well. Or maybe they have other kinds of neurological compromises. That's not necessarily by most people recognized as being a part of intrinsic foundational health. And so understanding the ways in which these things work together and what the foundations are of optimized brain function and how that can have an impact on virtually everything that adversely, everything that is, a mental, emotional, or neurological disorder. And so, it's going to be quite a wild ride, but I think it's going to be fascinating for starters, and I think really paradigm shifting for a lot of people that listen or that participate in that webinar.
Well, you've really made me wake up about a couple of concepts which I thought were, the new way, if you like, or the correct way of doing things. And it's like, hang on, mate, we're going down this marketing thing. Like, for instance, how often have you heard paleo dessert?
Exactly. Just don't even get me started. This is why I coined the term primalgenic, because I feel every time I get up and, in front of a paleo audience or somebody, or even ketogenic is equally becoming commercialized now and means all kinds of different things. And there are cookies and cream keto bars and things like that. Right. I mean, I'm ready to tear my hair out of my head. I feel like I'm trying to fit myself like a square peg into a round hole. Because what was inevitable with this? Because it struck a nerve. There's something about the paleo concept that seemed rational and logical to a lot of reasonable people.
Yeah.
But what was inevitable was that industry was going to look for ways of co-opting that and taking it over and commercializing it in a way that became profit-based instead of something designed to actually optimize health.
Yeah.
And, and our culture is very, very vulnerable to those marketing gimmicks. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there making a lot of money, telling people what they want to hear and selling people things that may taste good, but may not do a damn thing to benefit their health. I mean, if you have, a box of organic, gluten-free, non-GMO brownies, that are paleo friendly or whatever else, it's still crap, by any standard. So, but these things, just because you have something with a cellophane wrapper and a caveman stamped on the label or something like that, this is supposed to be, an ancestral food, and that's just not, frequently the case. And so I'm careful to distinguish.
I've got to urge all of our listeners to get your books. Look up on your site, the Primal Body, primalmind.com. Primal Body Primal Mind, and to tune in to the ATMS webinar on June the 5th, 2018. That's Australia time. I'll certainly be listening in. And I've got to say, if you ever come to Australia, I'm going to treat us as Tatooine, and I'm going to get you a lightsaber.
Excellent.
And I thank you so much for taking me through, really exploding some myths around paleo and primal diet and what we really should be awakening ourselves to. Thank you so much for joining us on FX Medicine today.
Oh, it's been an honor and a pleasure being here. And thank you. Thank you for having me.
This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. This podcast is brought to you by the ATMS, the Australian Traditional Medicine Society.